Welcome to Singing Demystified. I am Cornelius of Voice Studio East, and I am here today to talk about vocal registers. But since many of my viewers come from a background of complete vocal technique, it seems suitable to discuss the similarities and differences between the concept of registers and the concept of modes. A register is a collection of pitches united by being accessible in some particular manner, or being separated from other collections of pitches by some sort of boundary phenomenon, like, for example, a voice crack. The need to switch between registers can be compared to the need for a violinist to switch between strings, which would probably have been known as registers if not for the fact that strings is a more obvious term to use. Another example of registers can be found in woodwind instruments, where you can alter the pitch within the same register by closing and opening holes with your fingers, but also switch to a different register by overblowing the instrument, that is, blowing more forcefully. When it comes to singing, the concept of registers has to do with tonal or biomechanical discontinuities that are less absolute than the type just described, and which often leave it possible to completely avoid the discontinuity by routing around it, so to speak. For this reason, different theorists may enumerate the registers differently, depending on which discontinuities they emphasize and which ones they de-emphasize. The most obvious registration phenomenon in singing is that of voice cracks into falsetto as seen in yodeling. Starting with a study in 1993, a team of researchers headed by Bernard Roubaud used this phenomenon of voice cracks to create what I regard as the most quintessential example of a register-based scheme for categorizing vocal coordinations. They asked 19 subjects to produce glissandos, that is, vocal sirens, with noticeable register transitions, and thereby discovered 4 laryngeal vibratory mechanisms, which are generally known as pulse register or vocal fry, modal or chest voice, falsetto or head voice, and finally whistle register. But as these terms are sometimes used in conflicting ways, Roubaud's team labeled the registers M0, M1, M2, and M3. What makes this system so quintessential is that while the ranges of these registers overlap a bit, they still occupy mostly separate pitch ranges, and they can unambiguously be ordered from low to high. Thus, if we are making transitions from low to high, lightening the registration whether gradually or discontinuously, there is one definite path. We might conceivably skip certain mechanisms, but there are no parallel pathways to choose between for different stylistic effects. The progression is strictly linear, much as the strings of a violin are straightforwardly arranged from lowest to highest. The opposite extreme can be seen in a still voice training, which speaks of vocal qualities rather than vocal registers, proclaiming that each quality can be extended across the entire range from lowest to highest in parallel with the other qualities. Still teachers will grant that certain qualities are generally more suitable higher in pitch than lower down, or vice versa, but there is no basis in the still voice training system for ranking different qualities on the basis of pitch range. Thus, where Roubaud's system is purely a register-based system devoid of mode-oriented thinking, a still system is exactly the inverse, a purely mode-oriented system devoid of register-based thinking. The 4 vocal modes of complete vocal technique are a middle ground between these two extremes, namely a mode-based system with some attention given to pitch ranges. There is, for example, an overdrive pitch limit, and the CVT app mentions that singers often unintentionally enter reduced density for high notes, and that it is difficult to carry reduced density very low in pitch. While there is no canonical ranking of modes as pertaining to different pitch ranges, we can still plainly see that some modes have an overall higher pitch range than other modes. But while this makes CVT a kind of middle ground between two extremes, it is nevertheless much more mode-oriented than register-oriented. My own system of vocal registers is also a kind of middle ground, much like CVT, but leaning in the opposite direction. Like Roubaud's system, I classify vocal techniques into registers rather than modes, but unlike Roubaud, I allow for registers that run more or less in parallel, so that the categorization scheme is not particularly linear. My system does not concern itself with the extremes of pulse register and whistle register, instead ranging entirely in what Roubaud would identify as M1 and M2. But instead of these two registers, I distinguish 7 registers: chest register, call register, cry register, mixed voice, pharyngeal voice, falsetto, and head register. I intend to cover these registers individually in subsequent videos, but for now, here is a brief overview of the most common registers. Chest register is the first we will discuss, not only because it is the lowest of the 7, but also because it is the most commonly used register for speech. At loud volumes, it becomes very brassy to the point of having a very distinctive buzz in the tone. There's a grief that can't be spoken, there's a pain goes on and on. When sung more softly, it can be harder to identify, but it tends to have a certain warmth, and it allows for a very clear enunciation beyond what is possible in any other register. Most beginners will have no trouble finding chest register, but it may have certain coordination problems. Among these, the two most common are excessive airiness and a lack of twang. Both of these problems can usually be addressed by practicing loud, twangy speech. Soaring high above chest register, we have the head register, a whoopy sound used a lot by countertenors and female classical singers, and which, like chest register, is capable of being quite loud. In some systems of classification, head register may be regarded as a subtype of falsetto, but I join Manuel Garcia in locating the falsetto between chest register and head register. In pop, the falsetto is usually made bright and breathy, like this. Eternal silence of the sea, I am breathing alive. Whereas in classical, it is strengthened and made clear. Roughly in parallel with falsetto, we have mixed voice, which relies on a bit of compression for a restrained sound similar to the curbing mode in CVT. Gave you all I had and you tossed it in the trash, you tossed it in the trash, you did. Unlike the CVT curbing mode, however, mixed voice need not be metallic. This, by the way, is another major difference between my register system and the CVT mode system. None of the registers in my system are defined by the presence or absence of metal, thus all of them can be performed in neutral, which makes my system able to classify sounds a lot more usefully at lower volumes, where CVT has a tendency to lump together everything quiet under the banner of neutral. Finally, we have call register, which, as the name suggests, is what we use for shouting or calling out. And on this account, it is also the most characteristically belty register. It also runs more or less in parallel with mixed voice and falsetto, but sounds considerably fuller or chestier. Compared to chest register proper, though, it has more distance between the tongue and palate, created mostly either by lowering the tongue and larynx a bit, or by keeping the tongue and larynx more or less in place while tilting the head back. Ah-oh! Ah-oh! This increased spaciousness will tend to remove most or even all of the buzzing characteristic of chest register, and it can often feel surprisingly similar to falsetto, despite tending to be a lot louder. The distinction between chest register and call register may at a glance seem identical to the distinction in complete vocal technique between edge and overdrive, but there are two key differences. Firstly, as with mixed voice, neither chest register nor call register needs to be metallic, so they can both range all the way from the quietest volumes to the loudest. Secondly, the spaciousness of call register does not preclude adding lots of twang. Thus, not only can we produce a twanged call register, we can also use it to access a wider variety of vowels. In my life, I'm no longer a child, and I yearn for the truth that you know. The remaining registers, cry register and pharyngeal voice, are less common on account of being generally more difficult to access for most people. So in the interest of not overcomplicating this video, they will not be addressed until later in the series. In the meantime, let us take a look at the advantages and disadvantages of a register-based system compared to a mode-based system. Firstly, the biggest advantage of a mode-based system is that it is easier to learn because the modes constrain various tonal parameters, thus giving each mode a very distinctive sound. Conversely, one of the key points of register-based systems is that they facilitate a fairly even sound across a wide range of pitches. This does tend to lead to a wider tessitura, but it means the tonal characteristics associated with a given register are less distinct than those associated with a given mode, making them somewhat harder to learn. But here we touch upon what is also one of the greatest advantages of register-based systems. By producing an even sound across many different registers, we get a wide range of pitches that still sound very natural. The overall vocal range may not be much different compared to when using a mode-based system, but the range that is practically useful, the tessitura, will typically be much wider. It works like this. You can construct a registration pathway, typically starting from chest register in the low range and winding up with something lighter at the top, whether mixed voice, falsetto, head register, or pharyngeal voice. For example, a pathway I often find myself using is the one that goes from chest register to call register and then to mixed voice at the top. It sounds like this. Each of these registers has access to a wide range of dynamics, sound colors, and vowels, so I don't need to switch registers all that often. Also, because the higher registers feature darker resonance tunings, my larynx doesn't have to rise very much for high notes. This is a large part of what contributes to maintaining a natural, even sound across a wide range of pitches, not to mention that it would get tiresome to constantly have to move the larynx all over the place for an erratic melody. This method may be harder to learn, but once you have learned it, it is easier to use. For an example of how it might be used, here is how I would sing the end of the chorus from Faithfully by Journey. I get the joy of rediscovering you, but oh girl, you stand by me. I'm forever yours, faithfully. Or, for a somewhat more complex example, consider the climax of If the World Only Knew by Scott Evan Davis. If the world only knew what I could do, then I'd tell a different story. When you really nail a registration pathway, it can feel like the notes are just flowing out of you, and you will be able to maintain a smooth legato even when singing an agile melody with highly varied dynamics. So, if register-based thinking has all these advantages, you might be wondering, why even bother with modes? Well, for one thing, fluent registration is difficult to learn. Really difficult. Not only must you have sufficient skill to produce each of the registers in ways that allow you to sing with great versatility in terms of vowels and dynamics, you must also be able to switch fluently between them, often in the middle of a phrase. This takes a long time to learn. But the sheer difficulty of learning fluent registration is not the only reason someone might opt for a mode-based system instead. For one thing, vocal modes lend themselves more easily to what I call macroscopic practice. That is, the first glance at a song where you are just trying to dial in approximately the right sound, and then take it from there. As I mentioned in my video on how to practice, this is where complete vocal technique really shines. Moreover, mode-based systems often have fewer terms, and these terms are more intuitive, making them well suited for standalone consultations where the student doesn't want to learn a whole new system of vocal technique, but just wants a couple of adjustments here and there to something that is already working for the most part. Complete vocal technique has managed to boil the craft down to 4 modes, each with its own very distinctive sound, whereas my system features no less than 7 different registers, several of which have subcategories. This makes it less beginner-friendly, though I have addressed this shortcoming by introducing the registers one at a time, which is working well, but makes the early stages of the learning process less self-directed than with CVT, as it will be necessary to choose repertoire that relates to the skills currently being worked on. So, in summary, here are the differences between register-based and mode-based systems of vocal pedagogy. Mode-based systems consist of various coordinations corresponding to different vibes or attitudes that run more or less in parallel when it comes to pitch. Register-based systems, on the other hand, consist of coordinations that occupy different pitch ranges, though some registers may run in parallel, giving you multiple alternatives to choose from when devising a pathway from low to high notes. When using a mode-based system, you typically decide on one mode as the main sound to use for the given phrase or section of the song, though individual notes may deviate from it. When using a register-based system, you typically decide on an entire registration pathway. Mode-based systems are more intuitive, quicker to learn, and more oriented towards first-glance macroscopic practice, but register-based systems tend to lead to a wider tessitura and a more even sound. And that's about it for today's video. If you have any questions, be sure to leave a comment down below. If you wish to get in touch, you can click the link in the description to join my Discord server, or you can visit my website at voicestudioeast.com, where you can also book lessons with a 50% discount available on your first booking. Stay tuned, remember to like and subscribe for more content, and as always, thanks for watching.